Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Assistant Secretary Ryan, for a wonderful introduction to some of our broad numbers for this year. What I'm going to hope to do is drill down a little deeper into some of the details that I know all of you have been waiting to hear about. This is the outline of the topics that we're going to cover this morning. I will be sharing data with you about international students in the US. But before I do that, a quick word about how we gather our data on international students. This is an annual survey that we carry out across we survey between about 2,000 and 3,000 higher education institutions. And our respondents are all accredited institutions that are eligible to host international students. And the data that you're about to see comes from the 2012-13 academic year. So as we just heard, this past year we saw a large growth in the number of international students coming to the US. The growth rate was just over 7%. And in absolute numbers, the US now hosts the largest number of international students that it has ever hosted in its history. And that number is at about 820,000. For the second year in a row, we saw the numbers of undergraduate international students exceed those of graduate students. And this is a trend that's been driven primarily by the rising numbers of Chinese undergraduate students. A quick global view of where our students are coming from. As you can see, there's just one country shaded green, China. And that means that it sends well over 100,000 students. In fact, it sends about 236,000 students to the US. And then two other countries shaded orange, India and South Korea, also send sizable numbers of students to the US. For a few years in a row, China was again the top place of origin of international students. And when you take China, India, and South Korea as a group, those three countries account for almost half of all international students in the US. But we also now see sizable numbers from some other countries. So in terms of some of the other countries where we've seen a lot of growth, as was just mentioned, we've seen the numbers of Saudi Arabian students in the US go up quite a bit, by about 30%. Also, the numbers of students from Brazil, and also Kuwait. And what's common amongst these three countries is that they have all launched very ambitious, wonderful scholarship programs to try and send their students overseas. And Peggy's going to talk more about that later on. Here's a look at 12-year trends of the three top places of origin. You can see the spike for China, and that the numbers for Chinese students now outpace those of either Indian students or students from South Korea. In terms of world region, not surprisingly, we saw most growth from Asia, but there was also a 24% increase from the Middle East, though keep in mind that, that the baseline numbers are fairly small, especially when compared to Asia. I want to turn next to where our international students are studying in the US, and here's a look at states. So the three top states remain the same, California, Texas, and New York, and together they host over 30% of all international students. But what I want to draw your attention to are three states that saw a lot of growth, as indicated by the three green stars on the map, and these were Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, all three of which saw double-digit growth in their numbers of international students. Now, we know that all types of US institutions host international students, ranging from community colleges to large doctorate and research institutions. But the reality is that most international students are concentrated in just 5% of institutions that currently host international students. So what that's telling us is that there really is tremendous room to grow, both in terms of institutions who've never before hosted students to host students, as well as institutions to increase their numbers. Let's take a quick look at some of the demographics of international students. And I'm very pleased to see this trend that you see up here, that the number of men and women studying in the US is much more balanced now than it was about 30 years ago. About 30 years ago, 70%, or actually over 70% of all international students in the US were men. And we've now seen that gap narrow considerably. Most international students continue to pursue the STEM fields and business and management, but we see some really interesting variations by country of origin. So I want to share with you some information on who's studying what and what some of these interesting patterns tell us. So for example, if we look at Canada, we find that Canadian students are very interested in business and management, but they're also very interested in the health sciences and health-related fields. When we look at China, most students are clustered in business and management. For India, it's engineering and math and computer science. For students from Saudi Arabia, it's intensive English. And then we see another interesting pattern for South Korea, where we find that most students are either in business or in the fine arts. And then for the UK, it's the social sciences. So really some very interesting variations where students are coming from. Assistant Secretary Ryan mentioned the significant contribution that international students make to the US, not just financially, but also in all the other ways that they contribute to American classrooms and campuses. And according to the most current estimates, their contribution is over $24 billion. This is approximately $2 billion more than what we saw the year before, so it's a big increase. And most of this comes from the fact that a very large proportion of international students, primarily undergraduate students, are paying their way through their education in the US. I want to move now to another survey that we do that's separate from Open Doors but complements Open Doors. And what's important about this survey is that it tells us the why behind the Open Doors numbers, on what campuses are experiencing right now in the current fall semester, and why are they seeing and reporting the sorts of numbers that they're reporting. And we carry out this effort in conjunction with 7 other higher education associations, many of whom are in the room today. And we thank you for your collaboration on this important effort. So for this survey, which is just a snapshot and doesn't represent the full range of institutions that Open Doors does. For fall 2013, we found that campuses were reporting continued strong growth in their international enrollments. In fact, they reported about a 13% increase, and about 72% of institutions saw this type of growth. Most of the increases were coming, not surprisingly, from China, Saudi Arabia, but then Brazil too, because the numbers of Brazilian students have continued to increase, and then Iraq and Vietnam. We asked institutions for some context on why they were seeing these increases, and they reported a combination of factors that had to do both with what they're doing on their campuses in the US, but also factors at the home country end of students that might be driving these increases. So as you can see, some of the factors had to do with the institution's own efforts to increase recruitment, the growing visibility and reputation of institutions abroad, but also had to do with the growth of the middle class overseas, especially in rapidly growing new economies. So where are US institutions currently recruiting international students? Not surprisingly, all institutions were very active in South and East Asia, primarily in India and China. But we also saw a lot of activity in Latin America, as well as Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And the region that institutions were likely to be least active in terms of recruiting was Africa. I want to mention some other key initiatives that are currently unfolding on American campuses. There's a lot of activity and participation around many of the flagship foreign government scholarship programs that we've already heard about. 40% of institutions reported that they were very active in the Saudi Arabia scholarship program. Another 38% are participating in the Brazil Undergraduate Mobility Program, and 14% are very active in a couple of programs that are sponsored by the government of Iraq. About 18% of institutions said that they were participating in one way or another in the 100,000 strong for the Americas. And then finally, we asked institutions what they were doing to support international students who were undergoing a period of difficulty. And almost a quarter of institutions were providing a full range of services for their students from both Syria and Egypt.